the banhammer, the conversation becomes a little less interesting. Ooh, how do you feel about 7 lands and a growth spiral mirror, Craig?
Which mulligan rule are we using?
The current mulligan rule.
Oh, it's not the original one where if you have 7 lands or no lands, you just show them?
Yeah, it doesn't quite work that way anymore.
All right, then I'd probably mulligan.
You're thinking the era of have to or get to mulligan.
So you're trying to pin me down on a pick for this matchup. Who do you think has the more favorable end of it?
I'm interested. I think that you made a really compelling point about having Expansion, Explosion, and Teferi on the same side of the table. I think generally if Inglis's mana cooperates and you get through the early texture of the game, the jockeying for position, Inglis will be favored by some margin.
Sure.
Players get underway, kind of the standard fare, making land drops. You see a growth spiral there for Inglis. That's always a good way to start.
And already an interesting decision of whether or not he wants to just jam this wilderness reclamation on turn 3.
Yeah, and there's no decision like that to make lightly, right? If you're going to cast it here, you don't have to just worry about it getting countered. You have to worry about it maybe getting countered and then something horrible happening on the way back and getting under your negate.
Yeah, 100%. The worry is what your opponent does with their turn.
And Inglis decides just to shock land number 4, pass on the reclamation, plan here, cycling for a 2/2 shark. That's enough action. Helps him find maybe a 5th mana source here.
Yeah, the ability to put a little bit of pressure on the board, draw an extra card, and you left negate up, this is all good.
Draw off the cycle is Teferi Time Raveler into Brazen Borrower. No 5th land just yet. The shark will attack. Once you start missing land drops, do you think he's more inclined to start attempting something like Reclamation or Teferi?
100%. You don't want to just fall behind each turn trying to leave your mana up, especially if you think the opponent's just going to keep making land drops. So it does make me much more inclined to play one of these spells here.
He's giving it a good think. Zimet has a Plains on tap. You do know there's no growth spiral happening at the end step, but that does leave up a number of reactive cards.
Sure. Playing the Teferi here does play around the Ether Gust.
And that's where Inglis lands. You might see Zimet fire off Petty Theft. If there's any action, that's the only legal play. Take care of that shark.
Yeah, Teferi's so good against Brazen Borrower.
Yeah, no kidding.
You just can't get the best of Teferi.
There is a response. Petty Theft's going to take care of the shark. Teferi will resolve. And a -3, no bounce, draws a card, hits the land. That is a huge pickup for Inglis.
Yeah, and he gets to play it untapped as well. Kind of telegraphing his hand, but that doesn't matter here.
Yeah, life total not a huge thing. And like you said, that is land number 5, 2 untapped mana. Convenient for negate. Back over to Zimet, you see land number 4. There's an Uro in hand. If he wants to cast Brazen Borrower, has to do it on his own turn.
Yeah, super awkward because the Brazen Borrower is just so vulnerable to so many cards, right?
Absolutely. There's also just the real fear. You can try to cast the Borrower to attack down Teferi, but then just something massive might happen that completely changes the texture of the game. For example, Inglis's hand has Wilderness Reclamation and Expansion Explosion.
Yeah, next turn, David should be able to play the Wilderness Reclamation. He gets to untap his lands, and now he has the negate and the Brazen Borrower kind of as these insurance policies, which leaves him the next turn after that to cast the big explosion.
Very aggressive Hydroid Krasis, X = 2 showing up for Zimet.
Yeah, I actually like that line. If Zimet feels like this is a potentially dangerous situation, you got to just start finding answers as soon as possible, right?
Yeah, and this is wild. Inglis actually just petty thefts the Hydroid Crisis. Says, you know what? I'm pretty good with the battlefield looking kind of empty while I set up this reclamation.
Yeah, if the board is this clean next turn, we're just going to see a huge explosion, and that's going to wrap up the game, right? It won't win the game that turn, but it's just going to be so much advantage that it's going to win the game.
Right. See Reclamation showing up. Growth Spiral puts a Castle Vantress on the table, so the option to scry 2 there with the mana available. Negate still being left up. Brazen Borrower being left up. See what Zimet can do about it.
I think if you're Zimet, you just have to start jamming your most powerful plays here, and to me it would be Nissa on this turn. The opponent's only showing 2 cards. You have to say, all right, I hope they don't have a counterspell. I need to start attacking.
Yeah, makes sense to me, and it makes sense to Zimet. Here's an attempt at Nissu Shakes the World. That's going to draw the negate. No thank you, says Inglis. Plenty of blue mana for Borrower to show up as well. Borrower will attack Zimet to 16. We're looking at possibly an expansion explosion for 8 going upstairs. That's the big deal about this turn for Inglis.
And sometimes you just have everything, right? There were a few very important decisions that got made early on. Am I going to sit on my counterspell? Am I going to try to force a card into play? The first time around, Inglis chose not to cast the spell. And then the second time around, chose to play the Teferi, and they were both correct. Like 100% correct.
Yeah, just recognizing when to be how aggressive. Another very small thing, but an important thing, Inglis only has 1 red source, so is very careful to manually tap that Triumph for red before that Reclamation trigger.
Sure.
And Explosion goes off for 6. That leaves up blue and then green or white mana here. Full grip for Inglis. Zim will try to climb back into this game. You see the front side of an Uro. It's going to put him back to 13. Ooh, but Inglis did pick up another Explosion.
Yeah, all these extra copies of Wilderness Reclamation and another expansion explosion. The Teferi is still on the board, just protecting everything. This one's going to be all wrapped up.
Yeah, and that's the power we're seeing from this 4-color Reclamation deck. You know, this is a pretty nice position. A lot of similar things could happen if you didn't have Teferi. But Teferi just says, hey, this explosion is lethal and it's going to work.
Yep.
Uro does put a land on the table. See a plains here, but anything Zimet wants to do, will have to do on his own turn.
Yeah, and that's the rough part about some of these, this Bant Ramp deck, these control-ish decks, is they just don't play well from behind.
Right, and here you see main phase Brazen Borrower. And then, so Inglis, it does block Inglis's Brazen Borrower. Well, it would have had it not gotten bounced. That's the thing, though, about the Teferi is it mattered if Zimet had untapped mana. But once you cast the Borrower, the Teferi's static ability no longer matters, right? So the Borrower gets to connect, and now the math on the explosion is just lethal. Incredibly lethal, actually, with the second Wilderness Reclamation.
Yeah, this isn't close.
Yeah, even with the first one, a 0 mana answer to the Borrower was lethal. But how about incredibly lethal?
Yeah, no, it's worth the extra emphasis there.
We'll hand it to Inglis, though. I get a little bit sloppy, a little bit lazy when the game's rolled up, but this is how you'd play it if you were worried about your opponent continuing to exist in the game. No fear there, though. Inglis up game number 1 here in the semis.
Yeah, just really well navigated. Just played around a little bit when he could, jammed when he had to, got a little bit lucky, and that is the right combination, right? That's how you win events.
Absolutely. Type play like that definitely been paying off all day. David Inglis is our 1 seed here in this tournament. Play has already earned him qualification to our championship next Sunday, and vying for $1,000 today.
Dude, next Sunday is going to be sweet.
Very excited for that tournament.
I mean, I knew we'd have a lot of interesting people who would be, taking advantage of these events that we're having, but the list it's great.
Paulo Vitor Dama de Rosa, Adam Burchett, David Inglis, probably better known by Moto username Tangrams.
Yep.
If you've been around, you've lost to Tangrams.
Listen, when you've been around as long as I have, you've lost to everyone.
Let me tell you about some of the people I've lost to. If you're looking to get an edge here on the SCG Tour online, maybe you haven't qualified for a championship yet, maybe next Saturday is your last chance. This is our last qualifier before our championship. Head over to StarCityGames.com. For $7.99 a month, you can become a premium member. This could give you access to all of our articles, get insights from players such as world champion Paulo Vitor Dama de Rosa. Find out how he qualified for this tournament with Team of Reclamation.
Sure, or if you're just looking for some general life advice, you can tune into Patrick's Sullivan Satchel.
I do read the Satchel every week.
Me too.
The Satchel's a tough one to pass on.
It's just the right amount of Magic content and Patrick's insights and his experiences. It's a great mix. It's definitely worth catching.
I personally had had a big cube article drop for drafting the vintage cube, which is currently on Magic Online. Going to have more pieces like that if you're interested in that sort of thing. Quite a bit different from playing standard, but one of my favorite ways to play Magic.
I don't know, a lot of these cards that we're seeing show up in the vintage cube.
Like I was saying, Teferi Time Raveler is a high pick for me in the vintage cube. Players underway for game number 2. Looks like 7 card hands on both sides. Gross Spiral advantage to Inglis. Though it hasn't resolved just yet. Zimet thinking about a Teferi. Could leave up Dovin's Veto instead.
Yeah, these matchups get so much trickier after board where there's even more counter spells going on.
Once you pass on Teferi, I imagine you're making a loud declaration that the veto would tag a Growth Spiral.
Well, I don't know if that's 100% true because you're still worried about your opponent slamming their own Teferi on their turn.
Yeah, that's a really fair point, I suppose, given that this 4-color Reclamation deck, and I'm so used to the Teamer Reclamation side of things, but this deck having a 3-mana Haymaker, that's such a difference maker.
Yes, 100%.
There is the attempt at Teferi. That will get negated. That is bad news.
Yeah, all the wheels are going to come off here.
So there was an attempt at a spell. Now we go back over to Inglis. What I was trying to get at with leaving up the Dovin's Veto is it's very much in range for the Reclamation deck, if a Growth Spiral resolves, especially, to just make a land drop and hang out, and then you haven't used your mana.
Sure.
Inglis is gonna leave up Negate and Growth Spiral. Not gonna do anything too aggressive here. Now we see Zimet, another 2/2 Hydroid Crisis. This one relevantly looking for a land.
I feel like Zimet's kind of asking for it, just, every turn using their mana and just passing the turn with all the lands tapped.
I think part of the thing is that in a Growth Spiral mirror, it's often going to be the case where the opponent just has multiple counterspells in hand. And in particular with Zimet missing a land drop, you can just get demolished if you have to enter a counter war.
Sure, the land situation is huge in these matchups.
Teferi Time Rattler shows up and even bounces the Hydroid Krasis once again. I think that's the most 2-2 Hydroid Krasis I've ever seen in my life, and they've both just been bounced.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. You didn't actually want a 2-2. Let me give you another opportunity.
Right, let's try that again. No, I would really like a 2-2, says Zimet. That will work. Now you see a temple. Land number 5 was picked up by the previous Krasis. Inglis at this point getting a little bit flooded. See a couple negates. We'll cycle this Triome and try to do something more than just leaving up counter spells, because this Krasis does threaten to eat that Teferi.
Yeah, this actually has turned out just fine for No.
And land number 6 comes off the top. Now I'm liking Zimet's position quite a bit.
Yeah, I think Zimet's in a spot where they can obviously take down this Teferi and then play the game in a way that they don't have to tap out if they don't want to.
Zimet thinking about deploying Nisu Shakes the World. With 6 lands and so many 2-mana spells, that would be a really aggressive Nissa. Yeah, Zimet decides against it. You see the Krasis going for the Teferi.
Yeah, I would think with the Brazen Borrow's potential play, you have the Growth Spiral, and you have all of these interactive spells in the Dovin's Vetoes that you're going to try to be patient and, in maybe even just one more turn, you can protect the Nissa when you cast it.
Right. I do not fault Zimet for considering it. I do believe it was correct to pass on it.
Wow. Look at this draw.
The King?
The King.
That card's pretty good against Dovin's Veto and Aether Gust.
Yeah, it's funny because with the way the game has played out, you're real nervous about jamming the King, but there aren't actually that many counterspells that tag it, right?
No. That is super interesting. Yeah, the texture of this matchup, we see that main deck sideboard card in Aether Gust. We see a really powerful negate in Dovin's Veto, but creatures, especially non-green, non-red creatures, largely have free reign in this format. Inglis thinking about whether to attempt the King. Now, without a Reclamation, there's only so much you can do. There's still a lot of value attached to the card if it works, though.
Yeah, I was going to say that this is still a great spot, right? Because David doesn't have anything to do with the mana otherwise. Until Zimet decides to start walking into these negates, David was almost getting time walked each turn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the cost is taking down the mana for the second negate. I suppose the calculation might actually have more to do with what happens if Zimet just makes a Shark on end step. Suddenly you're just really under the gun of a ton of pressure.
Sure.
The Kenrith is down. You saw a Growth Spiral for Zimet, and Petty Theft can buy a good amount of time against this Kenrith, especially backed by a counterspell on negate. So there goes Petty Theft. That'll target Kenrith. Inglis lets that one go.
And yeah, trying to decide when you're going to use your counterspells is so interesting in these matchups.
Shock for land number 7 for Zimet. That's huge, because that means that this Nissa is safe. There comes Nissa. Yeah, you want to negate that one, but you can't. Dovin says no. Time for Zimet to go to work. This will wake up Breeding Pool. Here's an attack for 5. Breeding Pool does mean that Ether Gust is being represented. Inglis will redeploy the king.
Yeah, this is going to be a real test of how good the king is, right?
Yeah, how much can it come back from? Does get haste and trample. It can do some damage to Nissa. And there is still mana to give it a +1/+1 counter, so this more or less forces a block with the land.
And it's pretty nice getting a forest off the opponent's side when they've got Nissa on the board.
Right. Yeah, try to contain the stream of 3/3s.
Well, you kill a 3/3, but it's also 2 mana that they had access to.
Yeah. 2 mana is definitely a real amount in a matchup like this. See no blocks. Kenrith will grow. And 6 happens to be Nissa's loyalty.
How convenient.
That works out. Ooh. I think Zimet's gonna gust his own Nissa. Yeah, saves it that way.
I like it.
That is spicy. Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah, chooses to redraw Nissa. Redeploys that. That means this turn he can attack for 8. Kenrith is good for 10 life a turn, though. Here is that attack. Inglis to 5.
Kenrith is, but Kenrith needs to do everything, right? It needs to start attacking this Nissa. It needs to gain life. Mm-hmm. And, Gnome didn't make a land drop that turn, right? So presumably there's more action going on the opponent's side, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and notably, Inglis does not have the Reclamation this game, so the king can only do so much.
Yep.
There is an attack with Kenrith. This time, Temple of Mystery will jump in the way. Inglis will give the king trample. At least floating the red mana. There it goes. Alright, trample over for 3, Nissa down to 3 loyalty. Couple lands, a negate, and a growth spiral, the leftovers. Inglis will play a land and pass. So that looks like mana for 10 life and a +1/+1 counter. Or negate. Go back over to Zimet. Here's the front side of an Uro. Zimet very comfortably at 21.
So Kenrith reminds me of Umi's Always Jitty back in the day, where you never believed the card could do as much heavy lifting as it could.
Yeah, when it first came out, you had this idea that the game was actually continuing.
Yeah, it's just like, oh, I'm so far ahead, even if they draw it here. Like, I'm going to be able to race them to the finish line, right? Mm. That's what this situation looks like to me. Where it's like, hey, man, Kenrith might just do too much this game, all by itself.
The Betrayers of Kamigawa pre-release was one of the first sanctioned events I ever played.
Okay.
And it was like 4 round sealed pods. And I think it was round 3 I encountered Umezawa's Jite for the first time. And I gave it a read. I think I was a sophomore in high school at the time. And that was my first real experience with existential dread.
I also remember playing against that at the pre-release. And it was the last round, the finals or whatever it was for that event. And my opponent played it and I read it, and then he equipped and he attacked, and I read it again. And I blocked his creature, and I used some removal spell like a zap or something to kill my own creature because I couldn't get his off the board. The next turn, I did literally the same thing. I blocked, I killed my own creature. The next turn, I couldn't kill my own creature, and it got counters, and like 2 turns later, I died. And my opponent's just like, why are you killing your own creatures? And I was like, because if it deals damage to my creature, it gets counters. And he goes, what? He picks up and he reads his own Jitty, and he's like, I had trouble losing all day today, and I only put counters on it when it dealt damage to the opponent.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so berserk. So Inglis uses Kenrith to gain enough life to get out of the turn. Zimet's escaping Uro, though. That Nissa's still hanging around. Wilderness Reclamation picked up from Inglis, but there's some Dovin's Veto mana on the other side of the table.
I was going to say, that card's just a tease here. You think that Hope is alive, but no, Hope's dead.
Speaking of existential dread. Here, I have a Wilderness Reclamation.
Yes.
Kenrith will attack Nissa. Now Uro is hanging back with a 3/3 land.
And I was saying at the start of the game that I would have navigated some of the early turns different, but Zimet was very patient, deploying the early crisis twice, didn't seem super worried about the Planeswalker on the opponent's side, and looks to be winning this game in short order here, right?
Yeah, those 2/2 crisis really paid off. Just allowed Zimet to keep hitting land drops, and relevantly against the Teferi, 2/2 was big enough to get that off the table.
Yeah.
And knowing when to be patient and knowing when to be aggressive, that's just everything in these matchups. Sure, when your opponent doesn't show up and register all the busted cards, you'll get some easy wins with Uro, but the Uro mirrors have a ton going on.
You're making me think of the Pro Tour that we talked about earlier today.
Are you pining for an Oko mirror?
No, not at all, but it was just like every now and then I'd get paired against someone that wasn't playing Oko, and I'm just like, oh, thank goodness.
Oh, I don't have to think. Maybe I'll get lunch. Kenrith getting blocked by the Uro and the land. That means if the king wants to hang around, he will need to get Swole.
Yeah, there's probably just too much that Kenrith needs to do here. It needs to get big enough to fight both of these creatures and live, but also gain enough life, so that David lives the next turn.
Even if Inglis was playing in sort of the dreamland where Zimet just has no kind of interaction for Reclamation or anything, Inglis doesn't have enough green mana to pump 3 times and cast Reclamation. So you see him drawing a card there.
All right.
Now we'll go to game 3.
That was fun.
That was fun. I think that the early positioning with the 2/2 crisis, like you said, made the game really interesting. At some point, we see Inglis draw that Reclamation. We know about the Dovin's Veto. Long turn happens there. But a lot of the micro decisions leading up to that point can cause that game to move in a lot of different directions.
Yeah, and watching a game only from one side, where the opponent's cards are obviously in the dark, makes it just so much more difficult, right? And it makes it more impressive when the players navigate the game really well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's just a ton of very punishing cards in the matchup. You just, on a surface level, you're jamming some very important cards into cards like Dovin's Veto, cards like Ether Gust, cards like Mystical Dispute, that can be punishing in a kind of range of different ways. Then on top of that, just really powerful permanents just coming down on both sides. Kind of every decision is, what does my opponent do immediately if I do this? What do they do on their turn if I do this? And then what do I have to do from there?
Yeah, the decks are just like 2 mana ramp spells, a few counter spells, and then just haymakers.
Haymakers and really efficient interaction. Zimet currently has most of the mystical disputes in the sideboard here.
And a dream trawler in the main deck.
I wonder how much of that is just saying, I really don't want to have dead draws if I'm under a Teferi.
Well, and it looked like David sided out a bunch of Teferis.
That is wild.
I mean, it's possible that I'm mistaken, but I'm pretty sure that's what I saw.
Well, no, what I mean is the configurations are wild.
Yes.
It's hard to find 2 players to put them on both sides of this match and have games play out similarly. Zimet pretty happy with the 7-card hand. Got a Dovin's Veto and a Borrower. That's whatever, but actually pretty happy to hit your first 5 land drops in this matchup.
Yeah, it's all the lands that are the important part, right?
Absolutely. See Inglis mulliganing to 6, keeps a 4-lander, has a veto, and a reclamation.
And same thing, I think David is happy with that hand as well.
Oh yeah. Outside of the 6-card thing, but as far as 6-card hand goes, probably pretty happy. Some nice ones coming off the top for Zimet. Teferi, Time Raveler, and Isuzu Shakes the World. That's why it's so important to have a good amount of lands. In that way, this does kind of resemble a lot of historic blue mirrors.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And we saw how patient Zimet was able to be in the previous game, waiting on Nissa until there was also the counterspell backup for it.
Players just trading land drops in the early game. No growth spirals here, not just yet. Inglis has 2 copies of Wilderness Reclamation, shocks in land number 4, but it's going to hang out, leaving up this negate and this Dovin's Veto instead. Zimet also not interested in any action. Players just trading land drops for the time being.
A lot of draw go.
Oh yeah. Inglis picks up the king. Plays land number 5. We see the first play of the game, Zimet flashing in Brazen Borrower, a beatdown time.
Yeah, let's get that clock going.
Draws another land, so plenty of lands rolled up. Brazen Borrower knocks Inglis to 15. Now we'll see if Zimet is interested in trying to ferry with veto backup. He most certainly is. So there is the Time Raveler. That's going to eat a negate. And very importantly, Zimet lets that go. Knows that this Dovin's Veto is more important reactively than proactively. Inglis will fire off that Fabled Passage. Finds an island. Plays Castle Vantress.
Yeah, and they're each in a position here where they can play one of their threats and still have their counterspell magic up. So they're both doing the exact same thing on these turns.
Yeah, no kidding. An attempt at a spell, a counter spell. This time it worked. So battlefield stayed the same over that turn cycle. Now things start to get more interesting. Zimet has no counter spells, just proactive plays. Growth Spiral, Isuzu Shakes the World, Teferi, Time Raveler. What is your instinct on how to navigate this turn?
So I think if I'm Zimet, I say, hey, I'm pretty far ahead here. I can play the Teferi, and if it resolves, my Nis is protected next turn. And if it doesn't resolve, that's one more counterspell out of my opponent's hand, and I can probably play Nissa next turn.
Yeah, I can see that. See a cracking of Fabled Passage. The rope burning on the other side of the table. Zimet will start on Growth Spiral. Draws a Triome, and now another interesting decision. Is that a land, or is that 3-mana draw a card?
I think it's 3-mana draw a card, but you can put off that decision until next turn.
Right, Zimet shocks for an attempt at Nissa. That gets vetoed. Borrower continues to go to work. Inglis to 12. Now English has a choice between Reclamation and Kenrith. Now, we talked a bit in the last game about how Kenrith is generally very likely to resolve. And you got to imagine that's some of the motivation for getting this Reclamation down here, and that's what English does.
Yeah, and you still get the value out of your Castle Vantress, right, when you play the Reclamation?
Yeah, getting that scry for sure. Back over to Zimet. Facing that, is this a land or do I cycle this? And if I cycle this, do I do it before I play this Teferi? It is somewhat appealing to just Teferi bounce the Reclamation. Zimet's going to start with the Borrower attack. Inglis down to 9. Here comes Teferi. That's good. Inglis's last card is just the king. Teferi does bounce the Reclamation. Zimet finds a land. Now, I think you're pretty confidently cycling that Triome.
Yeah, but I like bouncing with Teferi first and seeing what the extra card is before you invest your mana into cycling a land.
Yeah, you had a play that just was good as a surface level. So Inglis gets to scry that Castle Vantress, couple lands on top.
Yeah, and I can't imagine we want to keep those.
I would be surprised. I don't know how much of this is just posturing, the looking at the battlefield with the cards on top.
Well, there might be some amount of math going on with the king and the Wilderness Reclamation. If you say, hey, I'm definitely going to play the king and attack Teferi next turn, and I'm definitely going to play the Wilderness Reclamation the turn after that, it's possible you want to make a land drop in there.
Sure. Yeah, more activations for 5 life or drawing cards, what have you. Mm-hmm. Inglis does scry both to the bottom, draws a Triome. Now the Kenrith versus Reclamation question is far more interesting, facing down open mana. Could Kenrith and haste it up? Could just jam the Reclamation? Gets to scry again? What are you thinking, Craig?
I like the idea of getting the Teferi off of the board as soon as possible. The flip side, though, is like, hey, what if we wait a turn or two? Does Teferi matter that much if it ticks up twice?
Yeah, with no instance in hand as well.
Yeah. It's like,
Kenrith does attack for 5 with haste.
Well, and the opponent tapped out last turn, allowing us to resolve a big spell on our Wilderness Reclamation. So it's possible that they just don't have counterspells, so we should jam it again.
It does make sense. Reclamation is the play from Inglis. Zimet's going to crack Fabled Passage before cycling Triome. Still has 2 mana left up. Could be a veto, could be a gust. Draw is Uro.
Still a good one.
Yes. Yeah, it's not fighting over Reclamation, but pretty dang good threat. There are bad answers, but there are no bad threats.
Is that a Zvi Mauschwitz philosophy?
That era, I don't think it specifically belongs to Zvi. I don't remember who said it. Might have been Castle.
Okay, I think there was a pretty iconic article that Zvi wrote, but I might be lending credit to the wrong person there.
I'd have to Google it. I've already said too much.
When you're as old as I am, it's easy to misremember things.
All right, Zimet is going to play that front side of a row. And an Ether Gust has been picked up in the interim. With Temple Garden, the mana is there to escape Uro and leave up Gust.
So do you leave up Gust, or do you just pick this Wilderness Reclamation up off the board right now? I guess with Teferi on the board, you can wait till the opponent's turn.
Right, yeah, with the Teferi on the table, I'm pretty interested in casting it when my opponent casts a spell or in my opponent's second main phase.
Yep, that's 100% right.
All right, Uro escapes. Tracks down a Brazen Borrower, and that first Borrower has been going to work. Inglis is at 9 and is still waiting on 3 points in this combat. Reasonable chance that Spectral Sailor is going to show up to block, I suppose.
I guess not.
Inglis declines, they'll go to 6. Drawing extra cards is pretty good too. What do you do with the Spectral Sailor?
I feel like going to 6 is kind of asking for it.
Happens to be Uro's power.
Oh, we couldn't just deploy the Sailor, right?
Oh yes, Teferi is there. That card's still good, huh?
Well, I did it earlier.
I was due to forget about it.
This is the first time it's happened.
Right. Back over to Inglis. There is Kenrith. Which means now is a pretty good time to Gust or Petty Theft that Wilderness Reclamation. Imagine because the Petty Theft plays on the Kenrith, which is just face up, you'd want to save that one.
Yep.
So here is Gust on Reclamation. Inglis will keep that on top, still trying to assemble that combo. Kenrith plus Reclamation. And if he wants the Sailor, he's got to main phase it, because Teferi Time Raveler's on the battlefield. You would hate to forget about that and narrate the game in a way where that wasn't taken into account.
Was it a net positive there if David decided to shock off of that land?
So it takes 3 mana to use the gain life ability. If that's what you're getting at.
The cards are so little.
Back over to Zimet. Opponent is at 6. There is a bounce spell in hand.
So do you just bounce the Spectral Sailor here, and you force Kenrith to block your Uro?
Right, yeah, the Sailor could not be redeployed, the Uro would eat the Kenrith, and then you know your opponent's drawing a Reclamation. That makes sense to me. Zimet wants to make sure he's not leaving it on the table. This is a high stakes match here. There is the Petty Theft on the bar, or the Sailor rather. Here comes Uro and Borrower. Put a temple on the table, why not? Let's scry.
Yeah, and Zimet just this close from closing out the game here.
Dovin's Veto scryed bottom. Dovin's Veto, no Neato. Uro's gonna eat Kenrith.
We're at that point, we're rhyming?
That's where we're at.
Alright.
We're working on a magic-themed Susicle production. I don't know if you were on that email chain.
I know nothing about it.
Spectral Sailor, Wilderness Reclamation. So this means that Inglis can draw some cards, but Teferi means that he can't play them.
Yeah, so he's staring down 3 threats, and Teferi can bounce the blocker. It seems like this one's all locked up. Really well navigated.
And Gnome Zimet has been very impressive in this semifinals match. Top 8ing today, earning a way into our Season 1 championship next Sunday.